Tova, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. For people who are returning, good to see you again. And congratulations to everybody. I don't want to jinx it, but I think congratulations to everyone for surviving the election. It's a very close call in my case. The only downside is that it deprives us of having the Zoom webinar we really planned to have, which was baseball under an authoritarian regime. And we were going to look towards comparative and historical examples with Adrian's help in Latin America. But that's not going to happen. I think that's better that way. But obviously, so we've been through the end of the World Series. We've gotten through the election, sort of. And now we're fully into the off season and looking towards next season. And so what we wanted to start out looking, and I'll let the panelists all introduce themselves if they feel like saying anything about themselves. But we wanted to start to think about today, first of all. Sorry, I got distracted. I should say actually first anyway, that the way we've usually done it, and I think we're going to do it this way, is we have a couple of questions that I asked the participants the panelists to answer and sort of around the horn, and then we can open it up for a little Q&A. And I think Lincoln may have an announcement or two at the end or at the beginning as he wishes. So anyway, so we wanted to look back a little bit more towards looking what's ahead of us in terms of next season, and also talk about what's happening in the off season. So we're going to start it out talking about how 2020 was, of course, very strange. And now that we are past it, what do we think next year's season is going to look like? What do we kind of want it to look like? And what is sort of the bare minimum we will accept in a season next year? And I think we want to touch upon a bunch of different things with this, but I'll kick it off to Steve to go first.
Well, we saw what we would accept, right? We would accept a shortened season in which the statistical performances don't even out over the amount of time that we're given. So we had seasons that were very, very good and very, very bad without the normal sense of reality that is instilled by having 162 games for the hot streaks to level out, or the cold streaks for that matter to level out. So we have, just to name one player off the top of my head, someone like Javier Baez have a miserable season for the Cubs, and then at least one outlet suggested he would be a non-tender candidate. I don't think that will happen in the coming weeks just because of that, because the Cubs are due to the pandemic now in a austerity mode, and that they would want to jettison a player based on both his salary and the combination of poor performance. And we really don't have a sense of what is real. One of the interesting things for me in the perspective of being a baseball prospectus writer and editor, and that is that we have to project players going forward. We have to project players based on past performance. We have to project them based on minor league performance. And to just give you one example, we don't know, the best prospect in baseball is probably Wander Franco of the Rays right now. Normally we'd be saying, well, at this time this year, he had moved up from AA to AAA, and he had performed well at AA, but maybe showed a vulnerability to changeups at AAA. And is he going to adjust to that? Are the Rays going to hold him back for an extra month due to arbitration concerns? Of course, the answer is yes, but we don't really know. We didn't see that happen, and we don't know whether perhaps he, this is unlikely, but sat on the couch all year eating banana pudding and gained 50 pounds, and therefore his status as the top prospect in the game is no longer valid. These are all things that we don't know, but we'll have to accept going forward. And the question that hangs over the coming season is, will it start on time? Will Major League Baseball start it if the process of vaccination that we have been led to expect will begin at the beginning of the coming year and perhaps extend until early to mid-spring isn't complete, and they can't have fans in the stands in all 30 markets? And beyond that, of course, is the question of what the inflection point is in terms of community vaccinations and community spread, where the number of people have been vaccinated such that the vaccine, though it is not 100% effective, is not encountering so much active virus in the community that you're still at a great risk for infection if you show up at the ballpark. So these are all things that we have yet to encounter and yet to solve, but that we've dealt with before and may deal with in some ways again, as we've seen throughout 2020, whether in baseball or more recently in the NFL, where the NFL just this past Sunday allowed or forced, depending on your point of view, the Denver Broncos to start no quarterbacks in a game because all 4 of their quarterbacks had become infected due to lax mask wearing and distancing protocols. We just roll with it because we don't have any choice.
So you think we're going to still be we're going to have to be still in a roll with it frame of mind, or we're going to lose our minds probably. But whether people will be patient enough to do that, we'll have to see. Craig, I'm going to ask you next, and also for you or for anybody else, to also think about the issue of the rules changes that they had in place for this year, but of course only for this year. Okay, maybe not just for this year. And you know what your thoughts on that, but anything else, obviously, of course.
Sure. I'll start with that actually. You know, the big one everybody wants to talk about is whether there's going to be the universal DH again. Everybody wants it, but it's in that situation again where everybody wants it, but the players don't want to give it up without getting something in return. The owners don't want to give something in return if they don't have to. It's ridiculous, but it's just, that's how things work with an arm's length negotiation. I find it fascinating that we're now, you know, almost a month into the free agency signing period, and we still don't know whether half the teams should be bidding on a DH or not. I mean, Nelson Cruz, the preeminent designated hitter in all of baseball, is a free agent, and he has to sit and wait because, you know, do I negotiate with 30 teams or do I negotiate with 15 teams? So from a on the field perspective, I find that to be pretty fascinating. I think there will be a DH. I think everybody liked it an awful lot. I think we're all invested in saying that Garrett Cole was the last major league pitcher to take an at-bat in a game that counted in the 2019 World Series. And I don't want to have to remember another fact, so I'm going to go with that. The season, I'm going to differ from Steve because he's in the projection business. I'm in the reaction business. So I actually love the fact that I have no idea what's going to happen with guys that didn't really play last year as far as prospects and minor leaguers and everything. And he mentioned Wander Franco, and I'll be telling this until the day I die. I saw Wander Franco play a couple of games in the Appalachian League at the Princeton Rays back in 2018 when I was down there in Princeton, West Virginia. And I have never seen anyone that young just look like he was dominating a league like he did. And granted, it was just 2 games, but he looked like he completely outclassed everyone on the field, and he was 2 or 3 years younger than everyone on the field. I cannot wait to see Wander Franco play. I hope he has not been eating banana pudding all winter or all summer for that matter. The big question and the big concern I have for the offseason is, other than the DH, is, you know, the schedule, right? Rob Manfred last week made some noises through friendly media that we might not have a spring training that starts on time, that we might have a 130 game season. We might not get started until May. It depends on what's going on with the vaccine and all that, which are all sensible things to say because there are a lot of uncertainties. And it would be better in my mind to wait until there is certainty and safety and things like that to play rather than deal with this just terribleness that the NFL is dealing with right now and all the uncertainty we had last year. But again, anyone who knows what I do knows that the first thing that I do is get suspicious of authority. And in this case, I'm suspicious of Rob Manfred floating that because I can't help but feel that this is the beginning point of a sort of a negotiation to get athletes the vaccine before other people. I think we're going to have this conversation soon. It won't be a conversation. I think that sports authorities, business authorities, people with power and people with money are going to be trying to assert themselves to get in on the vaccine line before maybe they should as far as risk factors go. And the thing that just popped up in the news over the weekend that made me think of this is there's a story, it's analogous to testing. There's a story, it was in the Seattle Times, but it's about a Los Angeles situation where nurses and healthcare officials at the UCLA Medical Center are very concerned, and they are protesting because they cannot get tests. They can't get COVID tests. These are people working in healthcare dealing with COVID patients, and they can't get tests. Meanwhile, last week, over 1,200 UCLA athletes were given tests. We saw this past year with Major League Baseball, with the NBA, with the ready availability of tests for professional athletes, that, you know, with the league authorities claiming they weren't taking resources away from everyday people. And that was a lie. We knew it was a lie when they were saying it. It was a lie in practice, and it continues to be a borne out lie now. I think we're going to see the same thing with vaccines. And the number one thing I'm looking for as far as COVID in baseball goes is how we are going to find, through whatever means possible, that Major League Baseball players are able to get a vaccine in February, when, you know, my father with a compromised immune system will not be able to get one until March. And that's going to be interesting for me. And when I say interesting, I say miserable.
Well, because I want to get back to the fun stuff, I'm going to call on Lincoln to maybe talk a little bit about, well, I'm just going to throw out there, maybe provocatively, that I actually like some of the rule changes this year. I'm pretty sure I like the 3-hitter rule, and that I hate the person on second base for extra innings rule. But anyway, what about you, Lincoln? What's next year going to look like, and what are you going to be okay with?
Well, I love being on panels with Tova and Craig because it's the one time I can appear like an optimist. For me, that's very unusual. So I appreciate that. You know, Craig talked about this notion of uncertainty. And, you know, uncertainty is one of the themes of 2020, and it's one of the themes of COVID. The other theme is that the rules don't apply to me, right? Every American is walking out there, doing their thing, going to their Thanksgiving with the thought bubble, I'm not every, but many, that say the rules don't apply to me, for me, because. And the second half of that sentence is like some kind of existential COVID Mad Lib. Because I'm tall, because my bicycle is expensive, because I really want to see my grandma, whatever it is, right? So I'm wondering how, and I'm going to get back to the stuff on the field, but I wonder how this plays itself out next season, as Craig mentioned. Because the answer is yes, the players will get the vaccines first, right? There was barely a mumble when they got the testing first. And we talked about this in one of our early SIAC meetings, how they were going to get it before school teachers and how that wasn't right. And that's what happened with regards to the test. And that will happen with regards to the vaccine. But I wonder about something else. For example, could a ballpark, you know, we're, let's just say Citi Field, because we're in New York, I'm in New York, could they say you can't come in unless you have the vaccine? Could they say you can't come in unless you have a mask on, right? That's a legal question. But the lawyers with whom I've talked about this, and I'm not a lawyer, much to my mother's ongoing chagrin, but the lawyers with whom I've talked to about this have said that it's a better chance of doing that than employers saying you can't work here without a vaccine, or the state saying that, right? So what about mask policies? But these issues are so divisive, right? Does a team create a problem for itself by saying there's a mandatory mask policy, right? So the uncertainty segues to me into a different way of looking at this, which is that this 2020 season showed me, as someone who is, you know, more of a conservative with regards to baseball than perhaps I'd like to admit. For example, I've always hated the DH rule. I mean, I remember going back to the mid 70s and I didn't like it. I always preferred National League Baseball, right? I don't love the 3-batter rule. I can live with it. The runner on second base is great if it's a little league game and there's no lights and you have to get home before dark. But that's the only place we should be doing that, in my view. But what I come to see during this season is that I'm wrong about a lot of these things. Not about those things necessarily, but where I'm wrong is that the sanctity of the 162-game season, right? The same, other than the fact that ultimately the wrong team won, right? The postseason was fine. I enjoyed it. I got into it, right? I was rooting for some teams, rooting against other teams, you know, wishing the Yankees had gone a little bit further, missing the Giants, but it felt real. Even though, relative to the length of the regular season, it was much bigger than any time in the past, right? So those things we're beginning to get used to. And when Craig says, you know, when you talked about, you know, will the players get the vaccines first? What sprung into my mind is that will they use this to leverage all kinds of changes, not just the on-the-field changes of the permanent DH, but the much shorter season? That comes to mind right away. Changes about, you know, Steve talked about, you know, will you hold the guy back? And the answer, of course, is yes. But will rules around that change, right? Things that you know, COVID gave COVID gave the baseball a different way to approach this kind of, and I don't like this narrative, but this baseball is boring narrative that has been around since at least the late 19th century. And which people at this point in my life just say to me to bother me. It's like something they say, it's like trolling me in real life. Baseball is boring, right? They know that pisses me off, but baseball used this as a way, we may never go back to 162 game season, even if we have a vaccine that works, even if we can. We may never go back to, we may not start with the Little League rule, but I suspect there will be some way to shorten games, even though for me a 17-inning game is a blast, right? And what I found that struck me is that I can live with those things. I don't need the 162 game season. Now you can say, well, what does it mean to be, a pitching record, say in a 90 game season as opposed to 162? But what does it mean to be a pitching record that was set in the 50s when most teams only put 6 hitters out, right? Or in the 30s when you had to be white to play. Right?
So okay, let me cut you off by asking you if you agree with me that the guy on second base thing that's not negotiable.
No, it's like I said, if you're playing Little League and it's about to get dark, it's fine. But in anything higher than about 8th grade, it's a terrible, terrible rule under any
Yeah,
circumstance.
exactly. Okay, anyway, I'll move on.
So I'm with you, Tova. That's it.
I just also want to make sure we include, and Frank, who's up next, aren't limited to this, obviously. But I do want to, everyone knows that I cared a lot about the social justice and political stuff, the voting stuff going on around sports during this year. And was very moved by some of it. And we did talk a lot about it throughout the year about, baseball relative to other sports and so on. I have not seen anything, I don't think, about, maybe one thing about whether NFL players are kneeling this year or not. And so I have this feeling like now that the election is over-ish, is this going to just sort of is it going to just dissipate and disappear? I mean, in baseball especially. So Frank, I wanted to throw that out there for you guys to take on or not as you wish.
Hi, thanks, Tova. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm heard. It's all kinds of technical stuff here today. Thanks for having me once again to this other new rendition of SIAC. It all depends on what happens off the field, right? As much as even people like me, sometimes celebrate athletic activism and really admired what we saw from athletes this year, particularly in the WNBA and the NBA and other leagues, and even sprinklings of that in Major League Baseball. I think, yes, a lot of the activism probably started to ebb because of the desperate need to vote Trump out of office. But I suspect that the issues are not going to go away, right? I suspect, let's assume that police violence will continue, that we will continue to see them act without, any sense of accountability whatsoever. We have very little indication that the Biden administration or governors or mayors are going to try to hold police accountable. There will be probably, and I'm loath to predict things. I'm a historian. I look at the past, but I think we could safely say that we have not seen the end of police violence against Black people and vulnerable populations in our society, which would mean that once the inadequacy of the Biden's administration's handling of these cases will become evident, I think we will see again athletic activism probably coming from other sports, probably coming from the ones who spearheaded it this year, the professional basketball leagues. Obviously the election shows that polarization is alive and well, it will continue. So we will see a counter action to the protests. So I suspect that some of this will spill into Major League Baseball again. Even if it is very much a lot of the symbolic gestures that we saw, watered down Black Lives Matter slogans, which may not be as evident or may just take the role of just another ad in the ballpark, as we saw in many cases. But I don't think the issues are going to go away. And I think so long as the polarization and crisis continues off the field, I think it's likely we're going to see some semblance of it spilling into Major League Baseball. And one of the things I'd like to talk about maybe after the second question is how this is going to really affect the game itself, right? I mean, I think we've seen, some signs of this in terms of the hiring of in Major League Baseball this off season. But yeah, I think that the need to get Trump out of office, trumped everything, if you will. But I suspect that the that the issue is not going to go away, even though Major League Baseball leadership is going to try to just push ahead and try to keep the game removed from the activism as much as it can. But I don't think it's going to be successful. It doesn't mean they're going to be impactful, but I think you're going to still see rumblings of activism in Major League Baseball, one form or another.
Well, and I'm wondering if, you know, the individual players who were particularly active and may have wanted to be active before, but didn't feel like they could, will now have sort of feel more free to speak out about stuff and continue their activism, like a Mookie Betts, because we got to bring up Mookie Betts.
I think it's because, you know, I think a number of the players, you know, much of the confessional that came out of the summer, right, or the players who felt like they have been silenced. And I think to some degree the silence was broken in 2020. And I don't think we're going to revert back to the authoritarian silencing of players like we saw before. In the same way, there will be efforts to do that. But I think that silence was productively broken this year.
Yeah. Adrian, so kind of returning to the original question, if you want to, you know, what do you think next year is going to look like, and what would be okay with you and not okay with you? And also the question about, you know, political activity and organizing as well.
You know, I think 2021 in baseball will probably be more, you'll actually see more activism than in 2020. I think this year, a lot of players were given ownership, kind of let's work together pass on these matters. But I don't see David Price being, if he comes back, he's not going to be patient about this. And I think even without Trump in office, the issue is, what are you doing to make Black Lives Matter? It's changing the presidency is one position, but Manfred's still going to be Manfred. And the other issue I see here that was avoided this year in a very significant way is, what the heck are we going to do with all these minor league players? Are they going to get the vaccine first? All these Latinos who are getting squeezed out of low A ball, rookie leagues, like what are we going to do about all those guys? Are they just going to disappear? And so baseball's development system, there's a lot of really, what I see as racial and social justice bent issues that are in the minor leagues that are not being addressed yet. And yeah, thanks, Justin. You know, Tim Anderson, Tony La Russa, there's a number of management changes going on where my hope is actually that players say, look, we got through last season, but y'all can't pull this stuff anymore. You know, and what we saw Reinsdorf do is try to pull that same ish again. It's like, I'm going to bring this guy out of the Hall of Fame, that Hall of Fame guy. Let me show you my ring. I'm a Hall of Fame guy.
Right.
To be the manager of a team in 2021. And Tim Anderson, Jose Abreu, all these guys who, and I think a lot of players were patient this year, but there's a level to that patience that has to be addressed. Where's Lindor going to end up? And where's George Springer going to end up? And wherever they do end up, are they going to be quiet and thankful? Or are they going to use it as a platform? I'm the highest paid player on this team, and you got to address these issues. And that's what I'm looking for in 2021.
And that's your expectation that will happen?
I think it can happen, yes. And, you know, very interestingly, Lindor and Springer are strong guys in terms of their beliefs, and they just haven't really been given the space to articulate that outwardly. And I think George Springer getting out of Houston provides him the opportunity to do so. Houston was very confining because of Jim Crane and the management style of the entire organization. And so, yeah, I'm really interested to see where George Springer ends up. Imagine George Springer on the new Mets. Is he going to be quiet?
If we're going to end up on the Mets, that's our next conversation. Or is every free agent going to end up on the Mets? So that's for the next question.
And George is a New Britain guy. He's a Connecticut kid. And yeah, I think he's going to end up in the Northeast.
I think they'll send Bobby Bonilla again.
That's right. Yeah, you gotta like what you hear from the new owner. Well, I wanna, I guess we're gonna move to the second question, and then maybe I'll follow up about something else. I was gonna maybe go off script a little bit to see if people wanted to talk about the future of the minor league at all, but let's go to the second question first, and then if we want to talk about that after, we can. So really, this leads very well into the second question, which is about the off season, what we've already seen and what we can expect to see. Now, I don't think anyone will quarrel with my saying that the most important thing that has happened is the hiring of Kim Ng by Derek Jeter, no less, by the Marlins. And a very bad team, but she's terrific. And, you know, I had almost forgotten about her when this happened. I remember thinking so long about, I was like a little girl myself when she first was working in baseball. I swear, I was in my 20s when she was assistant manager for the Yankees. And I remember her then and saying to myself then, 20 something years ago, oh, that's so cool. And then all of a sudden she did get hired this year. And I mean, I'm thrilled, obviously, but it really is what took so long. And, you know, how long until the next one? And I also was talking a little bit with someone about how, you know, that's kind of amazing in itself. She's been so under the radar, hasn't made a lot of noise, you know, about it over the years, which I don't know, probably wouldn't have been my style. So anyway, I just wanted to raise that obvious point before we even get going. But so what else about both the hot stove and also the economics of what's going on in baseball, both in terms of the hot stove, but also in terms of all these teams crying poverty and so on. So let me start with Lincoln on that one.
Thank you, Tova. And there's a lot that comes to mind, but I want to just start with a brief anecdote that has nothing to do with baseball, because this is what the Kim Ng hiring reminded me of. 1991, I was living in New York. It was election day, and I was in Chelsea for some reason, and people were celebrating. And why were they celebrating? Because Tom Dwayne had been elected to the city council. And if you don't know who Tom Dwayne was the first out gay person on the New York City Council. And I was, you know, I'm a kind of progressive person. I'm moved back to New York after a 20-year sojourn in San Francisco. And my first thought was, you mean this town didn't have a gay dude on the city council until today, right? I came from a city where we'd done that, you know, in the mid 70s. And reason I say that is there is this moment of, you mean there's never been a female general manager until today, right? And that's really striking. But there's a couple things about this hiring that I want to just kind of touch on. One is that I don't think there's been such a high-ranking Asian American in baseball. And that's significant also. But the story of this offseason is kind of the two biggest names that, I mean, other than the rumors, right? Where's Springer going to sign? Are the Indians going to trade Lindor? That kind of stuff, right? Which is hot stove-ish. But are Tony La Russa and Kim Ng. And these represent really different trends in baseball, right? I mean, I'm not going to flesh out anything more about Tony La Russa because Adrian nailed it. And then Kim Ng is really moving in a different direction. And that really captures for me the tensions here. It is also striking that this woman who has, you know, a not just a sterling resume, because she does, but also who everyone has said has done a good job wherever she's been. She was at the two marquee franchises in this game, the Yankees and the Dodgers. And she ended up at the Marlins, which, you know, Derek Jeter, who one of the first baseball pieces I ever wrote was your kind of standard, and this was back in like 2008 or so, how if Derek Jeter had spent his career with the White Sox and the Astros that were then not very good, he'd be kind of one of these Burt Blyleven types who we talked about how underrated he was, right? But Jeter as general manager is kind of, with not much to work with there, has been doing a pretty good job. The Giancarlo Stanton trade is looking like that was clearly a fleece at the time, and most Yankee fans weren't even smart to figure that out. He's now making this groundbreaking hiring. And to me, that's really interesting. And also, there's not too many people of color in such high-ranking positions in baseball anyway. So to me, this is fascinating. And my hope is that, I mean, obviously, I think the hope is that this begins to really open up not just baseball, I would say baseball on the field as well, right? It is clear to me that the skill set to, say, pitch in the major leagues is not bound by gender.
So
right?
Let me just ask the way I asked you, Adrian. This is your expectation, or this is your hope?
I said hope.
Okay.
My hope, but if it's going to happen, this is going to be a lynch. This is going to be a keynote here. I want to so the most interesting stuff doesn't involve players, because the positive you might be hearing in my voice about Kim Ng, I have the exact opposite reaction about Tony La Russa. And I'll just tell you one brief Tony La Russa story, because I know Frank, who got on this call about half an hour ago, is still waiting for that BART train. So I'm thinking about taking my friend with whom I used to ride BART a lot, because he lived in Oakland when I was growing up, and he was, not surprisingly, he was from Oakland. He was a big A's fan. And we got to college and out of college, and the A's won 3 straight pennants in the late 80s, early 90s, and they only managed to win 1 World Series. And we're not going to talk about that particular World Series for obvious reasons. But they lost to the Dodgers and the Reds, teams against whom they were heavily, heavily favored. And it was all La Russa screwing up. I cannot think, I'm not really thinking right now because I'm multi-talking, but I can't think of a manager in baseball history who went into the World Series twice with such heavily favored teams and lost. So I don't understand the X's and O's argument for hiring him at all. I just want to touch on one more thing about the hot stove, which is that I was doing research for a book a number of months ago. That book was a while ago. The book will be out in the spring. And for my research, I was looking at that first free agent season, that 76, 77 off season. And when you read that book, you're right, the Orioles lost to the Mets, but the Pirates weren't quite as favored, as underdog but anyway, and in that first 76, 77 off season, there was this feeling in all the local presses that we could get some of these guys, right? We could get, they're saying in Cleveland, we could get Reggie Jackson, because he was a free agent, or Raleigh Fingers or Gene Tennis. No one thinks like that anymore. That has changed a lot. But what we're also seeing is not just, so then there was this spate of articles around that time of how, you need you should read the business section, not the sports section, to understand, because, this kind of reactionary thing to players actually getting their share of the money. But you did have to be fluent in issues like free agency, et cetera, to understand what was going on in the offseason. Now, what I'm seeing, and I mentioned this before, but the logic and the way we understand baseball talent is such that whereas you don't see the kind of long, bad free agent contracts as much as you used to, although Steve Cohen may be changing that, right? But there is this sense of, yes, we are going to wait until that prospect, we're going to wait a few years because financially we want to control his best years, which means we're not going to see 20-year careers, right? Nelson Cruz is an exception because he's such a great hitter right now, right? Anybody would be happy to have him. But a guy like Brett Gardner, right, who is a useful 4th outfielder, maybe a 5th outfielder on a good team, isn't the option. People have figured out that you're just better off taking some young guy for a year who's just going to be around for a year for the money. And the problem with that is that it changes how we experience the story of the game, right? The story of the game is important. If you were, if you were born, I don't know, let's just say Joe Biden's age, right? So you're 103. Now, if you were Joe Biden's age and you were born, I believe in 1944, let's say, because he was born, he's from Scranton and Delaware and all that. But let's say for the sake of argument, you were born in Northern Manhattan, okay? If you were born in Northern Manhattan, 1944, when you were just learning about baseball, there was a rookie center fielder for the Giants, right? When Willie Mays retired, you would have been well into adulthood, right? The journey of the Willie Mays career. And it's not just one guy, but I think that helps bond us to baseball, right? For me, I'm just thinking about my personal relationship to the game. When to take on the other end, when Willie McCovey was finishing his career with the Giants, to me, it was amazing that this guy had played for the Giants when my mother was just out of high school. Like, that was wild, but that story was powerful. And to take a more recent example, when my friend and I were still waiting for that BART train with Frank, because he was an A's fan and we were so excited about this rookie left fielder, this guy who could just steal all these bases. And by the time Ricky Henderson retired, I was like a middle-aged father with 2 kids.
Has
right?
Ricky Henderson retired?
Well, not technically, but And I know this is a tangent, but one of the things that saddens me about the Hot Stove League now is that, one, it's not just that we have to pay attention to money, because you always have to pay attention to money, but that so many teams don't engage and their fans seem okay with that. And that there's all these incentives to shorten careers. And for me, that takes some of the poetry out of baseball. So I'll end there because I probably talked too long.
Yeah, well, Ricky is only retired when Ricky says Ricky is retired.
I tell you this much: Ricky Henderson could play left field and lead off for most teams in the big leagues right now, and he'd be pretty good.
Yeah, he might get a 20-year contract.
And he'd steal 70 bases and have a 370 on base percentage.
And he also is 103.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me turn to Craig to talk about a little bit more of the specifics of what's going on with the hot stove in the off season and the economics of it all.
First, I just want to respond to one of Lincoln's points. I agree that whole, having a guy with your team forever kind of is a bond. It's not as gone as some people say it is. It still exists to some degree. I mean, if I lived in St. Louis, I could say that, Yadier Molina's first full season with the Cardinals was the year my, almost 16-year-old son was born. He could have been a lifelong fan of, Yadier Molina's St. Louis Cardinals. There are guys like that sometimes, nowhere near as many as there used to be, but that's also good, right? Because players have a little bit more control over where they go. But I do agree with the general idea that we should have that, and we should certainly have more teams that are investing in the offseason, that are wanting to build winners. We're just not having that. We're having this complete move away. Anybody who reads what I write knows that one of my hobby horses of late has been the diversification of the business model of the baseball owner, to where the actual baseball team is now merely an anchor tenant at a very large mall that they now own that might involve business and condos and everything else. And it's getting to be a major drag that baseball is considered, sort of a sidelight business. And the investment in the team is nowhere near as strong as it used to be. I hope, and you've asked Tova a couple of times, is that your hope or is it your expectation? It's only a hope that we have an active offseason with free agency and teams building. But my strong expectation is that you're going to see the Mets being aggressive, partially because Cohen is new and wants to change the story of the Mets, partially because he's smart and he realizes that it's a great buyer's market right now. And if everybody else is sitting out, that you can do a lot of damage on the free agent market.
I'm not
with your team
getting a haircut.
But I think we're going to have a very slow off season. I think we're going to have a lot of non-tenders of arbitration eligible players coming up here very soon, which will increase the free agent pool, which will further depress the market. It's going to be guys scrambling for jobs late into the spring. A lot of players, I think maybe the most notable one we saw this past season was Yasiel Puig didn't find a team. I think we're going to find a bunch of guys like that who would be very useful players on a lot of teams, simply not getting work. And then, as someone else mentioned, I think Adrian mentioned the minor leaguers. I mean, that's going to be just a giant mess of where these players are going. And the backdrop of all of this is the upcoming collective bargaining agreement. The world may change fundamentally for baseball economics a year from now, when a new CBA is either negotiated or fought over with an extended work stoppage. I'm not sure which it's going to be. So there's another depressor on, do you sign a long-term deal right now when a year from now things might be very, very different, and it could be more beneficial to the team. It could be more beneficial to the player. We don't know. So when you have off-season stories like COVID, no one wants that one, but it's certainly a major story. And then you have stories like Tony La Russa and Kim Ng and everything. That is the stuff that is, for very understandable reasons, taking up the oxygen. I think, though, it's going to cover for the fact that this is going to be a very dreary offseason for fans who want to see their teams build and improve themselves. And that will only increase as the offseason goes on. If the uncertainty about the 2021 season persists and we don't know what the playoff situation is going to be, if there are noises that the playoff situation is going to be as wide open as it was in 2020, for example, because of a shortened season, all of these factors are leading to uncertainty. All of that uncertainty leads to a lack of a willingness to invest. We see stories a couple of times a week now about teams that have lost money, and whether or not those stories are true, whether or not the facts, like this Phillies thing over the weekend about how much money they've lost, whether those facts are true. The reason those stories exist are because baseball and their owners want those stories to be out there. So the strong message from everyone except probably Steve Cohen and maybe the Atlanta Braves, they've already signed a couple of free agents, is going to be that your expectations should be low as a fan. So my expectation is this is going to be a pretty weak offseason, and the only silver lining for it, and it's maybe not worth it, but the only silver lining is we might have an opening day in 2021, whether that's at the end of March, beginning of April, or the beginning of May, where we have no idea what's going to happen.
Right. Okay, got it. Yeah, and so Steve, also if you can talk about what about the off season so far and what you expect, and maybe any predictions, and also maybe a little bit more about people like Tom Ricketts crying poverty.
I just want to say, as Craig began talking, somebody's audio leaked through and they said very emphatically, I am not getting a haircut tonight. And can I just say, if you have the opportunity, take it, because I said that somewhere about the last week of February, first week of March, not realizing that we would never, ever get professional haircuts again. So what you see is me and my wife in kind of a bowl and some scissors, and it's been a horror show. So if you do have the opportunity to get that haircut in a safe way, I encourage you to do that, because you may never get that chance again. I mean, you can also
every night. I said it every day in high school, actually.
I also wanted to not let Kim Ng get lost completely, because we were talking about her before, and it's fascinating how history is cyclical, and that we've often had women in positions of authority, and then we find reasons to forget that they had been in positions of authority and shut them out again. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, Helene Britton owned the Cardinals. She wound up with them kind of by accident, but she was confronted with a manager, Roger Bresnahan, who was this hard-drinking, hard-bitten Irishman who essentially tried to tell her, I'm the man and I don't care if you own the team. I'm going to run it the way I see fit, and you're going to go play with your dolls and like it. And she fired him. And he did not own the team, and so he had no recourse but to bugger off wherever people like that go to. And
Fame, I believe.
That's what's that?
I believe he went to the Hall of Fame.
Well, yeah, eventually, but the Hall of Fame has never had character issues have never been a thing for the Hall of Fame, as you know. The Hall of Fame is a gold watch for people that we've somehow elevated to the level of some kind of religious pantheon, and it is the most cosmic waste of time. But let me not digress. I also wanted to mention Effa Manley, who was the co-owner of the Newark Eagles of the Negro Leagues and ran the business side of that business. I don't think she was involved in player moves so much, but she did contract negotiation and promotions and so on. And she too is in the Hall of Fame now, much belatedly. But it's a thing that we forget. Like we forget Jeanette Rankin was in the Senate or similar, or that Eleanor Roosevelt was in some ways more qualified than Franklin Roosevelt ultimately to be in politics. And the one sort of negative about her getting that job is similar to Mary Barra, who's the CEO of General Motors and is the first woman to run a company of that size. And it's that she got it at a moment where it was a very degraded corporation and not the behemoth that back in the 1950s was always watching very carefully to make sure that they had 49.99% of all American auto business so they wouldn't tempt the government to break them up. They're not like that. Shirley Chisholm, somebody in the chat points out Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm is another great example. What she got was a fixer-upper opportunity. And it seems to me that when women and minorities do finally get a chance to hit the glass ceiling, or whatever your metaphor is for the prejudices that have kept them out of those roles, it's usually with the worst opportunities, not the best. And in some ways, maybe that's a part of things that's natural, because that's where often people get their first chance, where desperation exists, but it shouldn't be that those are the only chances. And the Marlins are very much not a real team in a lot of ways. The Marlins do not draw. They do not draw in World Series years, and they do not draw in years when they don't compete, which is pretty much all but 2 years of their existence. So she's not going to be able to show, I don't think, create a consistent winner in the way that Theo Epstein might get to do back when he was with the Red Sox. In terms of the off season, the problem that's hard to project, as Craig said, is that we have at least 28, 29 teams that are bent on not spending. We have players who have pre-COVID legacy contracts like Nolan Arenado, who are very, very expensive, even by the standards of baseball today, but whose teams don't want them. And there are only so many places they can go. And if no team is willing to spend $35 million a pop, which is roughly what Nolan Arenado will go for over the next several years, half dozen or so years, I think, then there's no market for him. Simultaneously, we will see in the next couple of days if predictions for a vast number of non-tender candidates will come true. As I'm sure all of you know, teams can choose to offer contracts to players with whom they're willing to risk arbitration, players their second and third years of contract, or I should say major league service. If they do not choose to do that, they can do what long ago the Twins did with David Ortiz and say bye-bye, not realizing that he would probably go to the Hall of Fame with the Boston Red Sox. We might see that with lots of players. And at that point, as Craig said, there's downward pressure on the free agent market. So I don't know where all these guys are going to go. They're not going to be spots for all of them, or they're going to have to accept compensation that's vastly out of line with what it was that they had before. You know, I don't know if this is an appropriate comparison, but once you make these kinds of changes, they don't always get put back when the emergency is over. And I'm thinking of this. This is sort of an extreme analogy, perhaps, but after World War II, there was the expectation that the economy would shift from defense spending and deficit spending and go back to a peacetime economy, which was traditional in this country. We did not have a massive military establishment all the time, just in wartime. So essentially, before World War II, we started from scratch. Before World War I, we started from scratch with a very small professional army. And what you can argue about the rightness or wrongness of this, and that's not necessarily meat for this Zoom chat, but Harry Truman decided, based on prompting from the National Security Committee, that he would keep us on a wartime footing, and we've been on a wartime footing ever since. Asked how he would sell that to the American people, he asked, in fact, various Congress people how he would sell it, and Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg said, "You have to scare hell out of the American people." And that's pretty much never stopped since then, and we've had massive military spending ever since. So that's an example of when an emergency never ends, and we're going on something like 76 years since that emergency should have ended, but our priorities permanently changed. And one suspects that in the way that we discussed earlier, that if Rob Manfred got some of his fetishes in terms of baseball satisfied, in terms of runners starting on second and 7-inning doubleheaders and all that, that those things won't go away easily, because it's hard to give back something that you wanted and got, whatever the exigency that caused it. And similarly, if this off season is so difficult for the players in terms of compensation, and again, as my pal Craig pointed out, teams are simultaneously moving into revenue areas that mean that the team is just one more aspect of a much larger complex. Between the two, I think it's going to be very difficult for the players to get back to where they were without some kind of massive work stoppage at the end of this coming year. And even then, I'm not sure what that will achieve, just because of sort of the way things are generally trending.
Yeah, I mean, so to give a more current example of making changes during an emergency, and you probably won't go back, does anybody think that we're not going to have more vote by mail after this year? before.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think that the Republican state legislatures will try to kill it now.
The
Well,
Senate is going to convene, the Republican Senate, if they control it, and they will say, well, I guess Biden is president, but there was widespread voter fraud, and we should look into this. There'll be a commission, and they'll recommend getting rid of things like vote by mail. They will.
Actually, we'll be having a webinar on this on December 15th with several experts on voting reform at the Harvard Kennedy School. I can share the link. But anyway, so Adrian, I actually wanted to ask you something sort of related. Do you keep up with the Caribbean League during the off season?
Not during grading, end of semester. So once I'm done with grading, then I can turn my attention to what's going on in Dominican. Other than seeing Fernando Rodney with his hat pitching, being put on Instagram yesterday, I haven't really followed it much.
Yeah, I was just more broadly wondering also, are there any international players that anybody cares about? I follow the KBO, as you all know, but other than that. But so Adrian, any thoughts that you have on the off season, and if you want to give us any predictions for any of the big ticket items?
Yeah, again, I'm interested in what happens to Springer and Lindor. It's interesting about Epstein leaving the Cubs, and then people, raising the specter of like, should they let Javi Baez go? I think it was Steve mentioned that was one of the things floating through the rumor verse. And it's interesting because when the Cubs had the chance to trade their DH that plays out in the field every now and then, Kyle Schwarber, they kept on to him, and they ended up keeping all of these players they should have traded. And now, like, the idea is to save money by getting rid of the one player who's actually their best third baseman, shortstop, and second baseman. It's kind of mind-boggling, and probably center fielder too. I'm actually interested in seeing where guys end up. Not so much because it's going to be a bounty of great free agent pickups in terms of the players getting good contracts, but there's going to be, I think, as others have said, a significant shifting of where guys that we're used to seeing play in a certain place ended up next year. And it's not going to be driven by, we don't think he can be productive anymore, but it's going to be like, we don't want to pay him that much, so we're just going to let this guy float away. The other thing, and I brought it up before, and I'll bring it up again. So 2 years ago, one of the guys in my sport and society class here at the University of Illinois was our starting center fielder for the Illinois baseball team. And he's a kid outside of Chicago, grew up outside Chicago. He got drafted by the Cubs. He's so happy. He got up to low A ball. And when Ben Zobrist came down and was rehabbing, he got to play with one of his baseball heroes. There's guys like that all throughout the minor leagues who lost the entirety of their 2020 season. And like, what's happening in 2021 for their season? And that's a kid from the United States. I'm thinking about what is going to be the role of the Dominican Summer League, the Dominican youngsters coming in, the Venezuelan players. Like, there's, again, a very significant issue in how these guys can. There's going to be less minor league teams next year in 2021. That's one of the things I expect to see. Manfred's going to get his way, basically. And he's going to say COVID created new reality. So my plan is super smart and I'm just a genius. So this is happening in a moment where the players, the minor leaguers, were succeeding in their lawsuits against Major League Baseball. And yet I think COVID is shifting, and Manfred is creating a new minor league system so that those guys who would have benefited the most from the reforms in minor league baseball, better pay and such, will actually not be baseball players anymore. They're basically going to disappear because those jobs are going to disappear. And so that's, to me, is like one of the really interesting aspects of kind of the labor history of what's happening in baseball right now.
Yeah, and I'll mention we have, the group has talked a lot about doing an event coming up that focuses a lot on labor issues in baseball, because there's just so much to talk about there. So we'll see to come. Frank, going back to you. So I think going back to Kim Eng, and your thoughts about that hiring, both in terms of comparatively speaking to other excluded groups, as well as sort of putting it in historical context.
Yeah, thanks, Tova. Yeah, so the Marlins, obviously the Kim Eng hiring was historically important. There was that excellent piece in the New York Times that came out in October about women in baseball, management and coaching. It was like this kind of women's chat group. I guess Eng was a part of, that gave some interesting insights, right, on their experiences. Everything from minor league coaches to people in front office positions of various types. So, and then the Yang hiring happens in November, and many of us are going to laud Derek Jeter for that hiring, and I guess we should, especially the Yankee fans among us. But when she was hired, I couldn't help but think about the first Black GM who was hired in 1976, Bill Lucas, for the Atlanta Braves, right? And when we talk about inequities in sport, we segregate the gender one from the racial one, but I think it's always important to put them together. And there's some interesting parallels. If you look at, Lucas, who is a long forgotten figure, partly because he died young after 3 years for working for Ted Turner when he was the owner of the Atlanta Braves. It was driving him crazy. I mean, he died of a heart attack. I'm sure it was a stressful job, but he helped rebuild the Braves franchise in the late 70s into the early 80s, Bob Horner, Dale Murphy era, when they were actually competitive at that time before the 90s. But Lucas had been in the Braves organization for a long time. He had been kind of working his way up. He had been a player, minor league player, major leaguer briefly. He took that position, the kind of community relations position that sometimes is reserved for Black executives, right? And then he gets hired in '76, and so he was sort of a lifer, right, in baseball, analogous to the way that Eng had been working in Major League Baseball and professional baseball, for quite some time. So it's interesting to kind of think about that parallel trajectory, right? And to think about the Yang hiring, not just with respect to, the history of women in baseball, but the fact that we've still only had 3 Black GMs in Major League Baseball history: Mr. Lucas, Bob Watson, and Kenny Williams, right? Omar Minaya, when he was a GM for, Latino executive for the New York Mets, right? And in fact, the Marlins let go a Black executive right before they hired Eng. So that's interesting. That's probably coincidental, but it's interesting. Like they fire the Black guy and then they hire an Asian American woman. Probably coincidental, but it's an interesting. If you look at the Eng hiring in that trajectory, I think it's very interesting, right? And the question for me, as we think about moving forward and looking at her career, is what kind of GM is she going to be? Is she going to be another analytics dude, who's just going to dehumanize players and treat them like, chess pieces that we just pluck in? Probably so, because that seems to be the prevailing or the fundamentalist belief in Major League Baseball management circles. Though, if you look at some of the coverage of the new GM of the Anaheim Angels, Perry Minasian, I was struck by his profile. He's a part of the story about him is that he had been a bat boy and not a bad boy. He had been working for the Texas Rangers as a kid, like a clubhouse boy. He sort of fashioned himself as a kind of baseball lifer, not a Wall Street executive, right? And in some of the coverage in the LA Times, he sort of was saying, along with the manager Madden, that, well, he's somebody who believes in gut instinct and other ways to analyze players. So perhaps this might suggest that the kind of fundamentalism that guides baseball management that leads to Kevin Cash to take out Blake Snell in Game 6 of the World Series, perhaps some of that, there's a bit of a break in that trajectory. Probably not, but I think this is interesting. These hires within that context is interesting, because one of the great failures of the social protest movement in sports was the inability for the athletes, and I'm being hypercritical here, to really raise equity issues in the sport. Even the NBA didn't really do that very well either. So that the question of who is dominating management, how are management decisions made? Why is it that the management class is overwhelmingly white and male still? Those are the questions that will remain. And I think, the Yang hiring suggests that, that there may be some movement on that front. In fact, the same piece from the October New York Times issue said that there had been an increased presence of women in Major League Baseball positions, even though Major League Baseball got a C grade from the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports. So, I think it's important to think about this hire within the bigger context of inequities in baseball management, right? Not just in the trajectory of women in baseball, right? Because inequities around race and gender always are interconnected. And certainly the racial front, Major League Baseball is really lacking, right? Again, only 3 or 4 Black or Latino executives in Major League Baseball history. What kind of authority is she going to have anyway? That's another question, right? The GM job has changed dramatically. That doesn't have the same sort of power that it did years ago, in this bloated management class that dominates baseball franchises. So, I think we could celebrate the Eng hiring, but we should connect it to the inequity issues always. We can't sort of, kind of capitulate to the kind of tokenism that we often, we celebrate the hire and then we just move on, right? I think the question here is what kind of GM is she going to be? That remains to be seen.
Well, does the role the GM play, depend on ownership? And what do we know about Derek Jeter and his compatriots that can inform us how involved he's going to get or let her do her thing?
It depends on skill set also, and this may no longer be true, but in her previous stops, Kim Ing was more focused on contractual matters and more of the running a baseball operations department than necessarily the kind of scouty, evaluative kinds of things that that other GMs might have had as their focus as they came up, maybe being farm directors first or scouting directors. And so what will be interesting, and I don't think we've heard very much about this, is who she surrounds herself with in terms of those evaluators who will be able to give her the kind of information she needs to make the ultimate judgment on player moves and such. And then, as Frank said, as I said earlier, it's going to be also a question of resource management and allocation given the environment that the Marlins have.
She's also of a generation where she might not be all that, she's not somebody who, graduated from business school 5 years ago and is now working on the analytics. So we don't really know what her approach might be, but it might not be that heavily analytics based. And that may be why Jeter wanted her. So,
well, and I thought also from her press conference, she was talking a lot about player evaluation. That was not in the sense of analytics as much, but
I don't know.
Who knows? So in case anybody was wondering, Craig is not in the Zoom anymore because his power went out. So hopefully he can rejoin, but I guess that's unlikely at this point. So we don't have his wisdom anymore, or we could look at it as we can say fun things about him. Anyway, all right, so we're past 8 o'clock. I want to open it up. I think we can just have people unmute themselves, or you can raise your hand and Lincoln can unmute you. But before I do that, was there anything else that, about next season or the off season that everyone was really wanting to talk about that we didn't get to, or I didn't ask about?
I think we should talk a little about the minor leagues because we've kind of danced.
Yeah.
And it's something.
Although I wish Craig was here for that piece, but go ahead.
Well, I just think, I was struck by something about the minor leagues, which is that it's clear what Manfred wants to do, right? But it is also clear to me that, the Major League Baseball, the pre-COVID, the way minor league baseball players were compensated and treated was a real problem. We've all read about that. And the MLBPA was not exactly on the cutting edge of addressing that problem. And what that leads me to think is that I'm going to try to be concise because I've talked enough, but is that there's not a real advocacy for the minor league players. And the minor league players themselves, as Adrian indicated, these aren't people who come into this with a lot of power in the dynamic of professional sports today. So I think it's very much on the cutting board. It raises all kinds of questions. One is, what do you do about player development? So-and-so, this year it was, so-and-so looked really good at the camp in Florida, not facing live pitching, not in game situations, but, he was throwing hard in simulated games. I don't know if that's not the same as data from AAA over the course of, a bunch of starts or a bunch of playing the outfield or something like that. But I think Major League Baseball will get around that, because if no one has that data, but they're saving money, that works for Major League Baseball. There is also these communities where it is a not very expensive fun thing to do for the communities. Now I live in a city that has, I'm not very far from Yankee Stadium, and we have three minor league baseball teams. So but I don't go much. But I understand that in a lot of communities, minor league baseball is a big deal. It is inexpensive. I don't buy this kind of, they're just playing it for the fun, which is part of the narrative, which is I always find very upsetting because it's kind of flies in the face of the economic reality. But what will those communities do? My sense is that the answer that they'll just kind of let Rob Manfred take some beloved institution away isn't obvious at all, right? There will be, and this is what, to go back to something I was saying earlier about the sanctity of the structures as we've understood baseball. Steve touched on this too. COVID breaks that all down. So independent minor league teams, barnstorming minor league teams, instead of starting a whole team, a whole league and kind of, I don't know, let's just pick, a bunch of states in the South where there's not a major league team. You just put one team together from Nashville that's semi-pro and you play against other teams, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to reinvent this, but we're not going to get back to where we were. The finances of how you do that are not going to end up with, players being paid a reasonable salary. I don't see where it goes there. So those are just my preliminary thoughts, but.
Yeah, I was just saying in the chat with Justin that we've talked a lot about spending more time on the situation in the minor leagues, maybe going forward, but I'm sorry, someone was going to talk. Steve?
Yeah, I was curious about something that Adrian said right at the very beginning that seemed to infer from this minor league rearrangement something that's a little different from what I was taking out of it, because I feel like the proportion of players out of Latin America is going to be greater in the minor leagues than heretofore, in the sense that when you shrink the minor leagues so there are fewer slots available, and then you simultaneously truncate the number of rounds in the draft, which was a separate, the domestic draft, right? Then you're bringing in fewer American players and the demands that they make in terms of bonuses versus, I think, a greater proportion of players from places like the Dominican who are paid somewhat less, signed somewhat earlier to be put in those fewer available slots.
I think actually the majority of Latino players right now in the minor leagues are at the low A ball and below. So you see at rookie ball and low A, anywhere between 40 and 50% of the players are Latino foreign born. Those guys, and this is why I raised the Dominican Summer League, there is a possibility that Major League Baseball will boost up the Dominican Summer League in a certain sense and keep those guys offshore. And then, the ones who succeed there come in the A ball and double A. What I saw in kind of how the drafting of amateur players in the United States and from Canada and Puerto Rico has been trending more and more toward college. And the hope I think Manfred has is a lot of the analytics of baseball driven stuff would help them scout to colleges and let college pay for that development instead of the low A ball and minor leagues. And so I don't think the percentage, because a lot of kids, the minor leaguers from Latin America, what they face is when they're in low A or making the jump to A ball, that's right when an organization says, we don't think this guy has it, or he's got prospects of going all the way. I'll give the example of Ildemaro Vargas, who plays now with the Twins, was with the Arizona Diamondbacks. The D-backs were his third organization, and he was grateful for getting the chance to go to a third. Most Latino, Dominican, and Venezuelan players don't get a third organizational chance. They're lucky to get two. I don't think that economics is going to change at all. I think they're going to offshore it, and they'll do it in the Dominican a little bit, but I don't think a lot of those guys will ever get into the United States to play. And that's cheaper. And so I don't think the percentage of Latino players will actually increase, because you're actually, you're bringing them into an upper pay bracket that these guys did not want to be put in. And I see what David writes in the chat. Yeah, the independent ball that Lincoln mentioned might be a pathway for some of those guys to come in and get a shot to get back into it. But yeah, I really see a big change coming up in how development's going to take place. And I would keep eyes on that Dominican Summer League and how Major League Baseball deals with that. And again, the MLBPA is not invested in protecting the rights of guys who don't belong to their association. These are minor leaguers. They're not Major League Baseball players. And so who represents these guys?
Well, and Meredith in the chat brought up, what happens with the Dominican academies too. And I would also just say, try and think about what everything you're saying will do to the diversity within baseball as a whole. I mean,
yeah, that was the other point. Thank you, Tova. The minor leagues is the pipeline for African-American and Latino managers and coaches to become lifers to go up through the system. This is going to shrink that pool, that already often too small of a pool of individuals getting opportunities to show their abilities to become and move up into the ranks. Some guys like DeMarco Hill never get the chance, but a couple of them like Charlie Montoya have in the last few years gotten the chance of being an organizational lifer and getting the job finally to manage a major league team.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna see if people want to ask questions or make comments of their own for a few minutes while we have a few minutes left. But I think before we start losing people, Lincoln is going to tell us about his hope and expectation for our future.
Well, that's I was recently on a TV show. I do a lot of work in Georgia, in the country of Georgia. Some of you may know that. And I was on a Georgian TV program with a colleague and a friend who I've known for many years. And he wanted to talk about the American election, the future of Georgia-U.S. relations. And this first question to me was, with regards to both of our countries, could you speak about where we are at this moment in history? So with that in mind, no, what we wanted to announce is that so this is our sixth seminar in this series on Say It Ain't Contagious. And we have decided, based on feedback from all of you, but also from others who aren't on this call over email, we found kind of two things. One, people seem to enjoy this. We certainly, I can speak for all of us when we say we certainly enjoy doing this, right? But this format, while it's fun, it's limiting because I get people, it's video and you need time and it's an appointment and then the next day it feels not as fresh. And even though we put it on YouTube and we encourage you to watch it and circulate it. So we are going to be changing to a podcast format beginning in 2021 in the new year. And our hope is to start fortnightly with a substance like a longish podcast, and then maybe fill in the odd weeks with some smaller, shorter podcast with some combination of us. We will try to have the six of us on as often as possible, but maybe some weeks we have 4, some 5, we'll kind of rotate. We have a big pool of people, so we don't need to be on all the time. And we may explore the ideas of bringing guests on or focusing on one topic in a specific week. We also have the idea of doing, and again, we will make that podcast widely available through all the podcasting places so you can get it easily. We also may more infrequently do these as kind of, not a perk because we don't pay for this, but it's just a fun break we get to see each other's faces, because I do enjoy, I know I have email correspondence with a lot of you. It's nice to see your faces. I also have some people who are old friends and it's nice to see their faces. So that's kind of our thinking going forward. But we also just want to take this moment to thank all of you. Some of you have been on for all 6. I have a spreadsheet because when you RSVP, I have to put you on the list. So I have a spreadsheet, and some of you have been on for all of these things. And some of you have tried to make it to all of these things, maybe couldn't make it at the last minute. So, and some of you have been on to 3 or 4, or even if this is your first. This has been really the best baseball discussion I've had since, waiting with Frank for that BART train after the A's game. And I really enjoy it. And I hope that you enjoy this too. And we look forward to 2021 moving this in a new direction. But Steve, you want to add something to that, but let's get back to talking baseball.
I should add, first of all, and most importantly, I just received a text from Craig who wants you all to know that Colombo is available on demand and he didn't drop out just because Colombo happened to be on some cable system somewhere. He really is without power, and his Falk viewing will wait for another time. It's snowing in Ohio. Ironically, I was worried about my being able to participate because here in New Jersey, we're under a tornado watch because we're having a rather unseasonable series of thunderstorms today. So I'm happy that I'm still here, even though I know that all of us, including me, would gladly trade me for a Craig and a player to be named later. Someone asked in the chat what we're going to call this. As far as I know, the podcast will still be called Say It Ain't Contagious.
Yeah.
And I just want to echo what Lincoln said. My friend and colleague Cliff Corcoran earlier said to me that the video format, the appointment format is difficult. He said, I want to be able to listen to you guys while I am doing the dishes and preparing dinner. And so that is the concept behind podcasting. Obviously, there's time shifting involved for everybody. It goes out and then it's forever. And I hope you'll enjoy it. And as Lincoln said, we will still do these video conferences. We will save these nights for all of us to be together when the six of us feel special and when the rest of you feel special also, when the occasion demands for it. It will be a reward for all of us to be able to see your faces at those times. I know that the reverse is probably not true, that the value proposition for you is much less having to look at us. But regardless, that's the plan. So look for that at a podcatcher near you beginning after the first of the year.
So yes, and so thank you, obviously, and we're all really excited to do this as a podcast, and also, the topics that I've mentioned that we want to go more into depth on is the kind of thing that we might do the shorter off weeks about. We have a lot of ideas about that, and if you have anything that you think would be really great, you all have Lincoln's email, so you can email him. And just, for the last few minutes that we have, if anyone has any comment or question that they want to share with us in our time remaining.
And you can unmute yourselves now because
you can unmute yourself, or if you
want to chat.
Yes, I'm new. This is my first gathering here. Dick Grosmo, my friend Sharon, had invited me. I'm just wondering, this is a little bit off the subject, but I'm just wondering if anybody recalls a year where we've lost 6 Hall of Famers dying within about a 6-month period. And
Yes.
those of us in the Bay Area losing Joe Morgan, one of the greats, and those people in Detroit with Al Kaline, and I grew up as a Cardinal fan with Lou Brock and Bob Gibson. So it's been a year of a lot of loss of our sports heroes. So I'm just curious of your thoughts.
Yes, in 1972, we lost Roberto Clemente and Jackie Robinson, both in an untimely way. Gabby Hartnett, Beauty Bancroft, the old Giant shortstop. And I'm missing a couple others, but there were 6 Hall of Famers who passed away that year. This year probably exceeds that in some ways. It's obviously not for us to judge who felt more grief when and why. But the unfortunate, the thing that I find more, and I was technically alive in 1972, but not of an age where I would have experienced this firsthand. But both Clemente and Robinson were hugely important, obviously, in the history of the game. So these are really fundamental people to lose. And more than that, whereas it's hard to lose a Whitey Ford, but Whitey Ford's was in his 90s. Tom Seaver, obviously a very sad story because this very intelligent man had Lewy body dementia and then subsequently succumbed to that and to, I think, COVID as well. Jay Johnstone, a funny guy, succumbed to COVID, also had dementia. But these are people who were closer to the end of their lives, whereas Jackie Robinson was relatively young and Clemente was still playing and died on a mission of mercy. So I'm definitely not trying to make a direct comparison because, your reaction to any situation and the loss of anyone is going to depend on what your emotional investment in them was. But it's hard to think of something more painful than particularly losing those 2 gentlemen.
I just
One of the things for me about losing so many Hall of Famers is having attended so many, I think at least 6, maybe 8 induction weekends in Cooperstown. Like they didn't have an induction weekend this year because of COVID. Just to lose that many guys, Brock's presence, Joe Morgan, like they were very much present in Cooperstown. People gravitated to them, and you saw their smile and their joking. Whitey would show up. Didn't show up last year when Mariano got in. But these guys were people that you saw and expected to see in Cooperstown during induction weekend. Unfortunately, Clemente, it's always been his widow, who we also lost this year, Vera Clemente, and his sons who actually partook in Hall of Fame weekend. This will be felt differently in Cooperstown. The next year there's an induction weekend, because literally it's close to 1/10 of the people who attended as representative of Hall of Famers have gone, are dead. And that when I include Vera Clemente in that, because she represented Roberto's, and so that's 7 people. And typically there's 70 to 75 living Hall of Famers at any one time. So this is going to be pretty drastic, and it changes. Before all this happened, when Vlad and Vladimir Guerrero and Mariano, and before that Pudge Rodriguez, the Hall of Fame as an institution is really changing. It's becoming very Latino. There are more Latinos, living Latinos in the Hall of Fame than there are now African Americans. Because don't forget, we also lost Bob Gibson. So that institution is going to undergo, I think, a very dramatic change in how people. It used to be this is the truth, an old white guy's place, and with a few African Americans that were in there, and now it's actually moving towards a very different kind of Hall of Fame institution, and we'll see how that impacts the future of the institution itself.
It's hard not to think of like these passings as again, this is something that I was touching on, and we touched on it in different ways. Lincoln mentioned something like this too, with not continuity of baseball history, but the death of a certain kind of baseball man, and the prominence of many Black men of that generation in that group. Go back to Frank Robinson's passing, he's another great example. Bill, people like Bill White, there's all these folks that we don't see, and so it's gonna be interesting to see, as the game continues to trudge through the pandemic here, and in the coming years, who will be the baseball people, now that, we're slowly widening the gender conception of a baseball person, who have some connection to the game's past, because right now the game's past is just, kind of gets honored in these very, facile ceremonial ways, and they're not really fully integrated into the culture of Major League Baseball. I wanted to also just highlight one of our audience members, Evan Brown, has a question, unless somebody has another thought on this topic. Yeah, go ahead, Lincoln.
One last thought on Hall of Famers, which is that, some of these people, like Joe Morgan, was quite young. I mean, by the standards of today. Whitey Ford had a good long life. I mean, he died. He was a very old man. But this is how we understand. I mean, this is part of history, right? This is part of the kind of the, Whitey Ford is the last link to those kind of great Yankees teams in the 1950s. I'm a middle-aged guy. When I started following baseball, Joe Morgan was the best player around, right? He was the first 2 years that I followed the game as a young boy. Joe Morgan was hands down the best player in the major leagues, and Tom Seaver was the best pitcher. And Morgan in particular, who I never saw Willie Mays, but Joe Morgan's the most complete player I ever saw, with maybe the exception of Barry Bonds. I know Craig is not on the call, but I just want, if I can just share the screen for a second, and just so one quick clip about Joe Morgan that there's Frank Robinson. Now we're going to end there on that. I just want to point something out. That's the last game of the 1982 season. The Giants knocked the Dodgers out. The Dodgers had knocked the Giants out the night before. There's about 47,000 people at the ballpark. 46,000 had better seats than me. But at the very end, where I ended it with Lasorda going like that, if you see that clip, that means it was on the San Francisco television broadcast. The LA broadcast, they somehow didn't put that in. But all these guys will be missed. Gibson and Brock were like the legends of the game as I became interested who were on their way out. But wait,
Evan. So Evan, did you have a question that you want to ask?
Yeah. So this is kind of a question coming from a strange place, because in all of these that I've listened to, it's based on like the only optimistic thought that I've had. But sort of is going back to the discussion of sort of the restructuring of the minor leagues and this possibility of kind of offshoring it and sort of boosting up maybe the Dominican Summer League and things like that. And I guess I was just curious, probably Adrian, for your thoughts, but anyone's thoughts really. On one hand, like obviously this would only sort of happen in MLB's interests, right? But I was just wondering if there's a way that it sort of inadvertently could sort of work to the benefit of these players, particularly those who are sort of at that level that we've been sort of alluding to a little, but the ones who are kind of not really going to make it and are kind of, this sort of like reserve army of baseball that's just sort of there to sort of lower the prices for the rest of them, right? Just in terms of like, you're not having to, uproot your life, you're staying close to your support networks, you're not dealing with immigration, so on and so forth. Because, obviously on one hand, people might have other reasons that they want to come to the US and things like that. But I just feel like, that actually going to some, town in the middle of nowhere in Iowa is, no matter how like idyllic that might be, is like this sort of burden on the players. And so I'm just wondering if this offshoring, while on one hand, I think we're seeing it as this sort of negative thing with MLB restructuring the American minor leagues, if it presents a bit of an opportunity there.
I think they're going to pay these individuals a lot less than what they were pay them, even the pittance they got playing in the minor leagues in the United States. And Evan, unfortunately, it's precisely for the reasons that you list. We're providing you housing. We're providing you food. It's almost going to be like company town Dominican Summer League baseball. And so, and it might also, and this is again the interesting thing, call on the Dominican government to pitch in and help them out, to strengthen this league and help it work. And it will go from Major League Baseball and its affiliated minor leagues payrolling that to Dominicans paying for it. If you've noticed, when Major League Baseball has regular season games they do in Latin America, they've done it typically in Puerto Rico, and a couple times they had exhibits in Cuba. Why don't they do it in Santo Domingo? There's not enough money to sell it out, to get 35,000 Dominicans to play major league prices, not Dominican winter league prices, for the price of the ticket to get in. And so, the economy of this is one where offshoring is literally pay them less, have the Dominican government invest in this idea that this is helping them. And yeah, I think that whatever benefits there might be is counteracted by how organized baseball is going to expect the Dominicans to pitch in and to cover a lot of that cost.
Well, by stripping the minor leagues, I mean, there very well could be an inefficiency and glut to the minor league system as it's existed up till now. But it's a question of the minor leagues also being the place to develop fans and expanding future market value that way. So it's going to be a fascinating battle over the next 2 years.
And the question of where college baseball fits into this.
Oh God, yes.
And that's the diversity also. If the colleges start becoming the place, yeah. it sounds like we definitely need to do something
Yeah.
just on the minor leagues one of these weeks coming up.
And Robert Komorowski has his hand up, so if we're
And I think Andrew is I think you can unmute yourself if you want to unmute yourself. And then
Robert, do you
after
want to,
these questions, we should probably
yeah,
start
I'll
heading
continue,
on.
everybody. Robert, do you have a question?
For college baseball and the COVID crisis here, because a lot of universities, of course, are experiencing some serious budget shortfalls as well as athletic departments. And I think at the Division I level of college baseball, there's only like 24 scholarships. So they have to slice and dice those. I mean, nobody's on full scholarship, even at Division I schools, from what I understand. So I'm curious to get your thoughts about what's going to happen in the post-COVID world for college baseball and how that fits into the restructured minor leagues.
And if I remember correctly, it's actually 11.8 scholarships per baseball team. So it doesn't even cover half scholarship for all 30 guys that are on the team. And some schools carry upwards of 35. So yeah, it's not. And so, yeah, but this is what Major League Baseball is hoping for, is for other people to pay for the development, and they can slide these guys into the A ball or double A ball and just progress it up the line that way.
But this is how, a couple of things. This is how other sports work, right? I mean, this is the model. And,
Yeah.
and the minor leagues, which I kind of like, are the outlier, right? The other thing is that your question about how do the athletic departments at these universities handle that? The answer, of course, is I don't know. But COVID is, I mean, those of us who work in the university settings know that the conversations about how, or who have family in university settings, how we're going to respond to this, how this will change the institution, what this will do to higher education. These are all questions that permeate every aspect of higher education right now. And college sports are going to be part of that, because the other side of this is that college sports has taken this strange role of essentially, and here think of football, basketball, the real high profile sports, of being professional programs where they don't pay people and they generate revenue kind of, but then they, with the resources, you know, we're talking about UCLA earlier this year. The other question for me is also the junior colleges, right? Where you tend not to need scholarships because they're often basically free, right? Or they're very cheap. But they're only in some places, right? They're not, there's some complications there, but junior colleges have been a real pipeline to professional baseball. And that may grow also, because it's also less of a college. I mean, it may not be as academically rigorous, which some people don't want. If what they want is to be a minor league baseball player.
Yeah, this is just part of the massive restructuring of athletic labor. You know, I mean, the minor league question is tied to this bigger question, certainly in collegiate athletics. There's no question, because I mean, given the number of scholarships and given how baseball programs are not well funded already, you know, it doesn't seem to be an adequate way to develop players. You know, so and of course with athletes pushing for some sort of compensation at these Power 5 schools, you know, in the so-called revenue generating sports. So I mean, this is going to be a topic we're going to keep returning to, as we have. It always comes up in our discussion.
Yeah, it always comes up, and we're going to have to dedicate a time to it, as well as the labor issues. So I think we have to wrap it up there, though obviously this is a group that could talk about baseball all night. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and look out for information. I assume that will come from Lincoln's email about the podcast, and then the specialist. Meredith, I don't have the link yet, but I will send it to you. So thanks everybody for joining, and we will see you again soon, and happy holidays.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all.
Good night.
Next time.
Thank you
Thanks so
all.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.